I'm Kalani Craig. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the history department. And the clinical piece of it means that half of my position looks pretty much like any other faculty member. I teach and do research. But the other half of it is providing consulting on my main area of research, which is digital humanities techniques, and particularly how those digital humanities techniques work in classrooms and undergraduate classrooms. So what do we do when we take Facebook and try and think about how social media could be a way of understanding the relationships between people in a primary source from the past? It didn't start with Mark Cuban, but he's kind of the impetus for it. For us thinking about this right now, about 3 weeks ago he did an interview with Business Insider for the NBA All-Star Game, in which he said, in 10 years we're going to want humanities people, because all of the number crunching and data crunching that programmers and financiers do for us now will be automated. So when that's all automated and it's just results that get spit out at the end, you have to have people who are flexible enough, who have thought through the analytical and critical thinking terms in their educational background to be able to adjust to what gets spit out and to be able to fit that into a world full of people. So, and we've kind of been thinking about that in the history department for a while. We've been working through, like, what does it mean to be historians who think about the past when it's the 21st century, right? And we're 20 years into the 21st century. But still, you know, it's hard to adjust to that. It started for us about 10 years ago with the History Learning Project. So we had a bunch of people who were interested in not just thinking about how students learn history, but in how students become historians. And what kinds of disciplinary norms we have, what kinds of barriers to those disciplinary norms get in the way. 3 of our faculty, Arlene Diaz and Leah Shopko and David Pace, and David Pace just released a book on this, in fact, got together and did a bunch of interviews with faculty, and then they turned those faculty interviews into classroom practices that have affected how the history department teaches its graduate students, teaches its undergraduates, and thinks about what we do in our classrooms. And in the last 10 years, we've turned that into a sort of department-wide mandate that thinks about how to change what students are doing in our classrooms. So what do we do with all of the technology that infiltrates our daily lives? And how do we map that into the classrooms of historians whose expertise is not in that technology? And because I have both the disciplinary expertise and the technical expertise, we've been able to turn that into something that has changed a bunch of people's classrooms. So, for instance, I was just in a classroom about 2 weeks ago where a colleague in gender studies is looking at feminist indigenous activism. And her students are studying these little teeny tiny enclaves of activism all over the world, in Costa Rica and the US and Southeast Asia. And what she had them do was tie all of that together. She wanted them to see how those people interacted with each other, but we did it with network analysis. So we had them think through all of the connections that people in their enclave were making, the references they made to people who were in previous generations, the citations that they were using in their writing from other feminist activists. And we made each one of those a set of nodes and edges, a connection and a network, and we put them all into a single database. And then we visualized it for them, and they wrote an assignment about how all of those connections helped tie a global activism community together. But it took both my expertise and the expertise of the faculty member I was working with, Maria Bucudacard, to make that kind of exercise happen. And that's what we've been aiming for, is this, the bringing of the social media world into a history classroom in a way that both makes sense for the students because it's something they deal with in their everyday life, but is also rigorously applied to the discipline of history in a way that helps them figure out what it means to be a historian practicing in the 21st century. That's really important for us too, not just because numbers have meaning, but because numbers have context. There's always something happening in the social or cultural norms around the creation of those numbers, around the people that we got those numbers from when we did the study, that shape the behavior that created the numbers in the first place. So in my classroom, I teach a Black Death class that looks at 3 different outbreaks of bubonic plague over time. 6th century, the 14th century one that we all know about that killed half of the people in the medieval European and Mediterranean world, and then in Hawaii in 1900. In the transition from the 6th century plague to the 14th century plague, I actually have students interact with an epidemiology simulation. Because one of the things that we bring with us when we talk about medicine and science as inhabitants of a modern world is that medicine and science are true. They sort of exist in a bucket, and they're there and they never change, and we can go back to that if we want something stable. But that humanities are sort of movement oriented, they're interpretive. And in fact, if you look at how people respond to plague and all those outbreaks, the bacteria is the same. The basic structures that it has, the way that it creates chaos in the human body, all the same. But the way that we respond to it on all those outbreaks is totally different because of the different cultural and social norms around medical treatment. So we took this epidemiological survey that's all about numbers. How many people died? What percentage of the population was it? How long do you have to recover from it? Like all these numbers. And we gave it some cultural context. What happens when the priests start running away and can't provide last rites? So instead of just skulls, we turned the skulls red for the people who didn't get last rites. What happens when a third of the people who die can't be buried because there aren't enough people left to bury them? The gravediggers have run away or died. So now all of a sudden, instead of just a little dead body, you have a dead body that's left on the street lying sideways, mixed in among all the skulls that are dead. And how does that change our response to those numbers? So that when we read the primary sources about plague, one of the lines from John of Ephesus is that people were squished like grapes in a wine press by God. And students look at that and go, that's so dramatic. No, surely it couldn't have been that bad. And then when they go through this simulation that is effectively a scientific simulation, but with these cultural and social norms attached to it that shape how we respond, they start to think that maybe these descriptions of plague that are so horrific are real, that they can begin to inhabit a historical perspective that was hard to do before because the numbers just don't communicate the true horror of what it was like to live through a time when half of the population died. So, I mean, that's, when you talk about those numbers, that's why humanities folks think about the meaning, because those numbers come with context. They come with something that's already there that isn't just 3 + 5. The Black Death class is actually one of the places where I've experimented with teaching in my own classroom. And it's given me the chance to refine some of the things that I do when I go into other people's classroom. We don't all have computers, and not every student brings a laptop with them, so we have to think about how the classroom environment shapes what we can do in our teaching. What I used to do when I introduced network analysis was have students actually draw a network on a whiteboard. So I was teaching digital methods with analog tools because, well, for two reasons. Practically speaking, we can't guarantee that we have the computerization in a classroom to teach network analysis with fully digital means. But also, and this is where we kind of come back to that Mark Cuban interview, technology changes really fast. So the computer program that I might use to teach network analysis now isn't going to be the same as what I use in 2 years. And by abstracting the methods and having people think about it on paper or on whiteboard, we can actually get students to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it without tying it to that one menu command in the file menu in this one program, so that when that program becomes obsolete, they can transfer their skills really easily to whatever program comes next, because they have a general sense of what's supposed to happen in each of the programs and a methodological underpinning for their work. So in the Student Building 015 classroom that I'm in, because of the Mosaic Fellowship, I've had to think about how to redo all of that, because we have these huge monitors and computers at the end of a table for every 6 students. And that's made it possible to do some of these methodological approaches that I've been working with in an environment that's fully computerized. So that network analysis thing that I used to do on the whiteboard, I actually wrote a program for so that students can do live network analysis entry. They can enter a node, and if somebody at the next table entered it a few minutes ago, they can just reload the page, get the exact same person, and not have double entry for the same person, which creates real problems with a network. And that made it possible to show some of the entries live. So we can, as a new node gets entered, we can pop it up on the screen. It doesn't have any connections. Very few people in history fail to have connections with other people. So we need to enter that connection now, which makes the methods really easy to teach, but also shows them this really interesting historical network developing as they enter it. And that's become an NSF grant. So in addition to thinking about these in terms of what happens with our students here in their classroom experience, we're also thinking about what we can do to make other people's classroom experience better. How can we take what we're learning here in the history department at IU, map some of these pedagogical movements that we're making and help it make it possible in other classrooms. Both the classrooms like the Mosaic classrooms where you have every piece of technology you could ever want, and also in the classroom where you're underground in a basement and you've got a chalkboard and that's it. So thinking about how to fit those two things together has been a really big part of what we've done in the department.